And it's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Peter Spires, publisher, author of a number of books. And Peter is currently the Senior Vice President of the Boston-based Rhodes Scholar Program, which organizes cultural and educational tours for seniors. He is a graduate of Harvard College, the London School of Economics, and the Tuck School of Business Administration at Dartmouth. In his most recent book, Master Class, Living Longer, Stronger, and Happier, a prescriptive how-to manual for baby boomers facing retirement, Peter outlines a system he calls Master Class, with 4 facets, including socializing, moving, creativity, and thinking, each of which enhances lives and helps retard the effects of aging. You'll all be very glad to know that one of his key recommendations is enrollment in a lifelong learning program, such as ours. We are all witness to the efficacy of such programs in providing new friends, intellectual stimulation, and encouragement to try new things. Peter is going to talk today a little about his book, but more about the history of the lifetime learning movement and what it's doing in the United States. It's a great pleasure to welcome him here this morning.
Thank you, Jill. As I'm going to do probably the most self-referential topic you could do. A little closer, okay. The most self-referential topic you could have at a lifelong learning institute. I'm going to talk to a group of lifelong learners about the history of the lifelong learning movement. So I'm going to try to put it in a little bit of a historical context, and like any good family, I'll start with the parents of lifelong learning in America. So raise your hand if you ever studied American history. Almost keep your hand up if you liked it. Okay, good. That's just about everyone. Well, it's a very interesting story. I'm going to start with a quote from a book that's still regarded as one of the best windows into American character and culture by an astute Frenchman who toured the United States in the early 1830s. And here's the quote. I'll read it out loud if I can get it to advance. There we go. So the quote is, "I have often admired the extreme skill with which the inhabitants of the United States succeed in proposing a common object for the exertions of a great many men and inducing them voluntarily to pursue it. Nothing, in my opinion, is more deserving of our attention than the intellectual and moral associations of America." So anyone recognize this or think they know who said this? Tocqueville, great. So Tocqueville visited the United States at a time of incredible vitality, growth, and Western expansion. Everywhere he saw people striving for an advancement in an environment with really no institutions of any kind. And there were no, in Europe, noblemen or rich people would have given money to start institutions, but there was nothing like that in the United States. And the only way to get it done was to persuading others it was a good idea. Anyway, so the idea of self-organization is really sort of second nature to Americans. It's very much sort of the water we swim in, but it took a foreigner to see what it was, which is a kind of a really unique and fresh way of building institutions where there aren't any. So a few years before Tocqueville visited America, a Connecticut man named Josiah Holbrook published an article in the American Journal of Education describing an association of adults for mutual education with the goal of affording adults the opportunity for mutual improvement through study and association. In 1826, he came from Connecticut to Millbury, Massachusetts, and after a lecture persuaded 30 or 40 people who lived there to form a society for mutual improvement under the name Millbury Lyceum Number 1, branch of the American Lyceum. And the idea quickly caught on around the country as an organization where people, mostly young men, could make up for their lack of formal education and network with others in an economy full of the upwardly mobile. In 1829, one magazine described lyceums this way: "Wherever these lyceums have been established, they have been found to improve the condition of the people by introducing subjects of useful knowledge instead of the ordinary frivolous topics of conversation." The birth of Lyceum, a name inspired by classical Greek, coincided with the Greek revival architectural craze in America. It was only appropriate that many lyceums, like the one shown here in Lynn, Massachusetts, took residence in Greek revival buildings. A good deal of history was made in Lyceum walls. In 1838, 29-year-old Abraham Lincoln addressed the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, Illinois, on the topic of the perpetuation of our political institutions, when for the first time he articulated the idea that slavery was a dangerous institution that could destroy the American constitutional experiment. Next. Famous thinkers and authors like Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, or shown here, Ralph Waldo Emerson, found they could supplement their income by hitting the Lyceum circuit. Next. At a presentation to the Essex Institute in the Salem Lyceum Hall in 1877, Alexander Graham Bell gave his first demonstration of the telephone with a live link to his laboratory assistant in Boston. And finally, in 1896, the young African-American poet Paul Laurence Dunbar gave a poetry reading at the Lyceum in New York City. Next. At the height of, sorry, the numbers got a little distorted in this slide, but sort of a timeline that I'm going to build through the presentation. At the height of the movement, there were about 3,000 lyceums across the United States. They proved a durable institution lasting into the 20th century, but the original highbrow concept slowly eroded as many lyceums came to present more popular entertainment or became profit-making organizations. Next. If Lyceum was the father of the lifelong learning movement in America, Chautauqua was the mother. Founded in 1874 by these two men, Lewis Miller and John Hale Vincent, on the shores of Lake Chautauqua in western New York, as an organization for the continuing education of Sunday school teachers. It quickly expanded to include academic subjects, music, art, and physical education, in addition to religions. Back up one. Chautauqua was different from Lyceum in a number of ways. From the beginning, it was designed for both men and women. It was a vacation destination with its own hotel built in 1881, reflecting a wealthier society with an expanding middle class with more leisure and more reliable transportation. So if Lyceum was really a frontier movement, Chautauqua was really a child of the Gilded Age. But there was still something that really reflected America's Protestant roots. It's a vacation, but a vacation with purpose, without idleness. You go away to a beautiful lake, but you're studying and learning, you're on a schedule, you're doing something redeeming. Next. While the heyday of Chautauqua was the late 19th and early 20th century, the Chautauqua Institute continues to thrive to this day. In fact, we still do Rhodes Scholar programs at Chautauqua. One of the interesting offshoots of the Chautauqua movement was called the Tent Chautauqua, which moved around the country. They toured regionally or nationally and visited just about every town in the United States in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. These, as you can see in this picture, were family affairs. They were also a bit less serious than Miller and Vincent had envisioned, featuring popular entertainment as well as lectures on more serious topics. Both Lyceum and Tent Chautauqua became less relevant as the 20th century advanced. Access to formal education became more widespread, and radio and television became the main channels for entertainment. Grassroots lifelong learning really lay kind of dormant for several decades, awaiting a seismic demographic shift and the invention of a new phase of life called retirement. Next. This chart shows in 10-year increments actual and projected total U.S. population in blue and the 65-plus population in green. In 1900, there were 76 million Americans and only 3.1 million people over 65 years old. If you made it to 65 in 1900, your typical life expectancy was about 10 more years. But if, like most people, you had spent your life working on a farm, in a mine, in a factory, or as a homemaker without labor-saving devices, you were pretty exhausted at 65. Fast forward to 1970, just a few years before Elder Hostel was founded. Next. In 1900, 1 in 25 Americans was over 65. Next. By 1970, it was 1 in 10. And by 2050, it will be 1 in 5 Americans will be 65 or older. So next slide. Some of the things that happened, and you can click the next several slides. You know, work used to be farms and mines, and then office work really became more the norm in the 20th century. And then the last picture is Alexander Fleming, who was the guy who I guess discovered or invented penicillin. And we had a lot of advances in public health in the 20th century. And we'll click again. The last thing was this is a Social Security card from the 1930s. And as the nature of work changed, as public health advanced, meant that people felt better in old age. Social Security built an economic safety net for an age cohort that had always been one of the nation's poorest. And suddenly retirement was a life stage, not just an economic status. Next. So this is a Time magazine cover from 1962. And I don't know if you can read the name, but it says Builder Del Webb. Anyone ever heard of Del Webb? He did, actually, didn't he? Anyway, Del Webb is, I believe, a very important figure in the evolution of retirement as a lifestyle. He was a visionary who saw that a new life stage was emerging and marketed the idea that retirement was a time to move someplace warm, like Arizona or Florida, play golf, and you can see behind him a shuffleboard court, and live out your golden years. And while that's now kind of a stereotype about retirement, but really before about this time, retirement really didn't exist as a lifestyle. But not everybody wanted that vision for retirement. And in the 1820s and 1830s, as I said, Americans lived in a frontier society and had to form their own institutions. Retirees in the 1960s and 1970s were pioneers too, facing a wilderness with few institutions to serve a new set of needs. So just like the early Americans Tocqueville described, they took matters into their own hands. And next slide. If there's a place that marks the start of the lifelong learning or the learning and retirement movement, it took place here at the New School for Social Research in New York City. In the same year, next slide, same year that Del Webb was on the cover of Time magazine, a group of retired teachers who were not happy with their union in New York City was giving them some programs, but they weren't happy with them. They went to the New School of Social Research and asked them about access to more academically rigorous courses. And the New School readily agreed to a 3-year trial of a new organization called the Institute for Retired Professionals. 400 members were selected, actually in a competitive process, from 3,000 applicants, and each paid $45 for a year's membership. But the truly innovative feature of IRP was a set of weekly seminars organized and taught by RIP members to themselves. Again, just like the early Lyceum movement. And while this picture isn't from 1962, it is from the New School, and it shows their director, Mike Markowitz, addressing an audience on the occasion of their 50th anniversary in 2012. So this was the birth of the lifelong learning movement, quickly copied at my timeline doesn't really show that the organization was the second one in the country, but that's history for you. There's always a little dispute over some of the facts. That was the birth of the lifelong learning movement. It copied quickly at by the mid to late 70s, Duke, Syracuse, Harvard, Emory, handful of other colleges and universities. And by the mid to late 70s, there were 35 to 40 LLIs in the United States. Next slide. And I don't know, does anyone know who this guy is? I know Claire, who's my colleague from Rhodes Scholar, knows who this is. Anyway, this is one of the co-founders of Rhodes Scholar. We had two men, Marty Knowlton and David Bianco. David Bianco, who just passed away a few months ago. David Bianco was the dean of student life at the University of New Hampshire, and he hired Marty Knowlton, who was kind of a hippie, really, who had traveled around Europe and gone to the folk schools in Scandinavia and had been the chess coach at Brookline High School and had this kind of peripatetic, varied sort of career. And he hired him to run the youth hostel on the campus of UNH in the summer of 1974, I believe it was. And they were sitting around talking one night, and one of them said to the other, what this campus needs is not a youth hostel, but an elder hostel. And with that sort of germ of an idea, by the next summer, they launched Elder Hostel on 5 campuses in New Hampshire. And originally they were programs where you would come for a week and stay on campus and take courses in 3 different subjects and have time for cultural, music and things like that in the evening. It was very much a kind of a residential campus model. So if the LLIs are sort of the modern lifelong learning institutes are the modern lyceum, Elder Hostel, now Rhodes Scholar, is the modern Chautauqua. So next slide. By the end of the 1970s, both lifelong learning institutes and Elder Hostel were well established in the retirement landscape. So I'll read a quote from an early Elder Hostel participant that I think sums up sort of the social atmosphere in the period when both the early institutes and Elder Hostel were founded. Next slide. And remember that people who in 1975 would have been born about 1910 who were going to these programs. Those of us depression babies who never had the opportunity to attend college are now able to engage in programs that enrich our lives. Since our return from the Elder Hostel program, we have purchased or borrowed books to further study the subjects presented to us. Medicine has increased our longevity, and Elder Hostel has added the stimulation to enjoy it. Could have said the same thing about lifelong learning institutes, but I think this woman, Geraldine, really understood the sort of social historical moment she was living in. Both Elder Hostel and the early institutes recognized their mutual kinship. The guy who wrote an early history of Elder Hostel saw that and wrote about it in his book and said both programs depend on the active personal involvement of particular participants. Both programs assume that learning capacity does not decrease as years increase, but that in fact learning is a conducive means of self-fulfillment for elders. Next. In 1986, after trying to develop a national coordinating body themselves, various institute leaders approached Elder Hostel about creating a national mechanism for coordinating their efforts. The Elder Hostel Institute Network was founded in 1987. In 1988, an Office of Institutional Support and Development was created, and a director was hired to lead it. And in early 1989, the first edition of Network News was published and distributed. And all through the 1990s, Rhodes Scholar or Elder Hostel before it supported a staff of 4 people in our office in Boston, dedicated to working with people in communities all over the country who wanted to start LLIs in their community. And it was very successful. Next slide, and click again, please. The chart shows the growth of the number of LLIs over the decades. And you can see that the big period of growth when 200 LLIs were founded was the 1990s. So this really was sort of the coming of age of learning in retirement. Then the next, you can click the next one too. Just in the early 2000s, sort of the next big wave of support for lifelong learning in America came from this man whose name was Bernard Osher, who made his money. He founded one of the biggest savings and loans in the country and started a foundation and began by giving endowments to the University of Southern Maine and Sonoma State University in California, and really liked what he saw and saw that they could use the money, and started giving $100,000 grants to lifelong learning institutes to build their membership. And if they were successfully met their membership milestones, he would give them endowment grants of $1 million to support a full-time staff and continuing development. And in return, they had to agree to rename their organization the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at wherever it is. So, around here we have those. There's one at Brandeis, there's one at UMass Boston. I don't know if Tufts might be an Ollie as well. So that's been a great, his money has greatly fueled the further growth of the Lifelong Learning Institute. So today there are about 120 Ollies, as they're called, many of which are members of our Rhodes Scholar Institute network. And I'll read another quote from a man who actually I got to know when I was writing my book. And it kind of shows the connection. I have been involved with the University of Dayton Lifelong Learning Institute since it was founded 11 years ago. I helped put it together, was founding treasurer and later president. When I retired, I wanted to pursue some academic interest that I had neglected during undergraduate days. I attend classes every session. They're too good to miss. So this is a man who knows Rhodes Scholar well and his Lifelong Learning Institute, and you can see sort of that connection in the lifestyle. The next slide, I'm going to just click until you get down to social engagement. Very small, I'll read these out loud. We've surveyed Lifelong Learning Institute members to understand what it is that draws them to their organization, and broadly I've kind of grouped them into 6 categories. First, learning. This is an educational experience that constantly amazes and informs. People are very aware these days that learning is an important component of cognitive health. So another said, a great place to keep your brain from going into atrophy. It's part of a retirement lifestyle. I love it. I look forward to it. I wish I had joined sooner. I now plan my year around certain classes and events. Value, there's no better bargain. In the surveys we do of lifelong learning institutes from all over the country, I'm always astounded at how inexpensive it is. It's really one of the great bargains in America. Kindred spirits, the LLI introduced me to community and friends when I moved here and had no connections. And then a similar kind of comment, social engagement, it is like a family. Next slide. We did a survey we took a survey that the National Council on Aging did to a representative panel of older Americans about people's outlook on the future, their sense of optimism, sense of well-being. And we found that, and then we did the same survey to people who were in lifelong learning institutes and people who went on Rhodes Scholar programs. And I'll just focus in on one of these. In general, would you say that the past year of your life has been, and then those who said it's been the best or better than normal? From Rhodes Scholar, 47% of the respondents said it was in that category. LLI's 49%. And the general U.S. population, only 24% of people say that the year has been the best or better than normal. So we see that the people who are involved in organizations like this or like Rhodes Scholar are really experience a great sense of well-being. So I just want to talk for a few minutes before I wrap up and take questions. So next slide, about what might be coming in lifelong learning. And clearly it's going to be more and more the role of the internet is going to be important. And next slide. Online courses, learning has become a big business with private companies like Coursera and university consortiums like edX leading the way. And sometimes these college courses are called MOOCs, massive open online courses. And I'm curious, has anyone here ever tried taking a MOOC online? Okay, we've got a couple people. And I'm curious, did you complete the course? No, okay. So this is interesting because this has been the big rap on MOOCs, that tens of thousands of people will sign up for them, but no one will actually finish them. And they're really just, I think, too big and too impersonal. So the next wrinkle is something called SPOCs, and they're called small private online courses. And SPOCs attempt to recreate the small class feel where a lot of the learning comes from the interactions with that you get from other students in the class. And they've shown that completion rates from SPOCs are much higher than MOOCs. And you're starting to see some of these available more broadly, like a Harvard X, which is the Harvard branch of edX, began offering a small number of SPOCs in 2013. But you'd have to apply, and you'd only be accepted after an application process. But so this format clearly is going to be more expensive than a MOOC because it's fewer people and more hands-on from the instructor. But I think that I think this is coming, and I think we'll see more and more of us trying courses like this. So next slide, and you can click through until there's lots of other, the internet is offering lots of other ways to learn. I put up a lot of you, any of you listen to podcasts ever when you're walking or doing anything? So you might be familiar with Serial, which is sort of a spin-off of This American Life and gained a lot of attention recently. There's lots of resources for foreign language learning online. Not only kind of one-way courses like Duolingo and others, but interactive programs where you can have an instructor who you're interfacing with through Skype online and working on conversation, and the same for music instruction. And then click it one more time. My favorite website for online learning resources is called Open Culture, and it's basically a portal for free cultural and educational media on the web. And some of the statistics, I was looking at it last week. There links to over 1,100 free online lectures, 1,000 MOOCs, 725 free movies, 700 free audiobooks, 800 free ebooks, 200 free textbooks, 300 free language lessons, and 150 free business courses. But there's still more, and I'm curious whether you click the next one more after that too. I have one of these here. Anyone ever seen one of these? So, do you get the New York Times delivered at home? Anyone on Sundays? Anyone get the New York Times? Because in the fall, you might have gotten one of these with your home delivery. And what this is a kind of a low-tech virtual reality headset, and you can stick your phone in. It has to be a smartphone, and put in your earplugs, and you look through it, and you can have a virtual, kind of a somewhat low-tech virtual reality experience. And when I do this at home, my kids think it's pretty funny because I'm standing in the middle of the family room, turning in circles to see the whole field of vision. And anyway, they find that pretty uproarious. So, but the New York Times, it's really an interesting sort of learning environment that I really recommend everyone at least kind of experience. The New York Times has a separate app called NYT VR, New York Times Virtual Reality, and I've looked at they do stories basically. One I looked at was a 7-minute news story on child refugees around the world, and another one recently was on the dolphin communication, so the whole thing is underwater and very immersive. And then when I was looking at yesterday, it was actually filmed in a pizza shop in Iowa during the primary campaign, and it was Ted Cruz coming to give a little stand-up talk to a bunch of people in a pizza parlor, and you could turn around and see Ted Cruz, but the people behind you and look at them and see how they're reacting. And I will say that even in virtual reality, Ted Cruz's hand gestures don't look any more sincere than they do and when you see them on television. So, next slide. This is a more sort of a high-tech visualization of VR. It's coming into the gaming world, and I'm beginning to think about how soon it will come into travel, and either as a way to get ready for a program, or maybe even for people who don't want to or can't travel abroad anymore, you might be able to have a virtual travel experience where you would be maybe even looking at a live 3D image from someone who's walking down the street in Paris with a VR headset on that's filming the 360 degrees of what's going around you. And I think that's may seem a little far-fetched, but I predict that that'll be here before long. I think it requires a lot of bandwidth, but I think it'll be something that we'll see before too long. But last slide. I still think, for the time being, that warm breezes and the smells and tastes of food in the south of France will be preferable to virtual reality, and I hope that's certainly the rest of my career at Rhodes Scholar, that's the way people prefer to have these kinds of experiences than through virtual reality. And that's my quick breeze through the history and possibly some of the futures of learning in retirement. And I'd be happy to take any questions people have about this or about Rhodes Scholar or about my book Masterclass. And thank you very much.
In my research, Peter, I found a reference in the 1970s to some that the AARP issued some charters in lifetime learning, and that's the only I couldn't find any more information about that. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, I think what I've found by looking on the websites of some of the lifelong learning institutes that I found to have been established fairly early, where they say that they were established in certain years. So I take that as I assume they would know. So, but I don't know about an AARP charter process. That's new to me.
I'm a little bit confused about our name. Are we lifelong learning or lifetime learning? And what's the difference? I see lifelong all over your slides.
Well, there are organizations that are called Institutes for Learning in Retirement. Like I was just out a few weeks ago in Hadley, Mass, where at an event it's called 5C ILR, 5 College Institute for Learning in Retirement. And there are others that are called Encore Societies. There are others there's a whole set of nomenclature around these organizations, but they really kind of do the same thing. And I think the term Lifelong Learning Institute might have gained currency in maybe the one that's the most common because of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute common sort of nomenclature that they use and actually sort of really impose on people as a quid pro quo for an endowment. But I think they're all everyone's kind of after the same thing, and yours is clearly called lifetime learning. So, and I slightly prefer, honestly, I even though I'm bucking the common trend, I like learning in retirement in some ways, because lifelong learning has some other meanings too. It kind of is a sort of whole vocational side of lifelong learning, especially in Europe. Lifelong learning clearly means adding to your professional skills as you go through your career. So, but then I certainly acknowledge that the term retirement is now something which is kind of fraught with a lot of negatives, and not even really. It used to be true that people would work up until a Friday and they'd be retired starting Monday. It's not really that way anymore. People are working part-time. They're starting businesses, as a sort of a second or third act in their lives. So, retirement's not a great term. And AARP doesn't even barely uses the word anymore. They just say they go by their initials. So it's I think it's a combination of a dirty word and a word that's no longer very accurate. So it's kind of going out of favor. Yes.
Do you know if anybody has published the plans for that little cardboard VR that we could actually make our own? Go
Well,
to
I
the
don't know
Times
that,
site.
but you can buy them on Amazon for about $5. So it's I mean maybe it's $10, but it's and there may be some, but it does have a kind of it has a lens in it, which I don't know whether I'm happy to show it to you afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
But I don't know how hard that would be. I wouldn't be able to do it. I know that, but someone more handy might be able to.
One of the things that you touched on that seems really significant to me is that it's not going to be simply life learning in a post-retirement experience, but because virtually all of today's labor force is going to be needed to retrain and supplement. So really, in a sense, our whole society is going to be engaged in continuous upgrading of our knowledge.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely true from the point of view of what to call things, though. You know, the type of learning that goes on here is really more sort of elective, liberal arts type of learning. I don't think there's anything that goes on at most lifelong learning institutes, which is about is really career or vocation focused. Not to say there isn't any, but to me it just raises the idea that there needs to be some way to describe it that distinguishes it from what you're describing, which is completely true, that there's going to be more and more retooling and relearning and for people to stay up with technology or new demands that are kind of workforce requirements. Okay, thank you again.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Peter, for giving us so much to think about. And well, I just wanted on behalf of everybody here to thank Peter so much for that really interesting history of lifetime or lifelong learning institutes. And I wanted to say now that we're going to take 5 minutes. We're going to have a little intermission, just a break. We would appreciate it if you've completed the questionnaires just to pass them to the back where somebody will be collecting them, because as I think Bill mentioned at the beginning, there is going to be a prize. There will be a drawing, and one of the questionnaires, one of the people here will win a small prize. So thank you very much, and enjoy chatting with your neighbors or stretching, or just take 5 minutes away from the program.